Welcome to this afternoon's keynote address, everyone. We're so glad to see so many of you here still. I have the great honor of introducing Luís Roberto Barroso, who's the president of the Supreme Court of Brazil. Chief Justice Barroso has served on the Supreme Court since 2013. Much of this period has been incredibly contentious and controversial politically and judicially, so we're in store for a really interesting session, I'm very sure. He also served from 2020 to 2022 as the president of the Supreme Electoral Court, which is Brazil's paramount electoral administration body. It's also been involved in some really interesting controversies. Supreme Justice Barroso has a law degree from the Universidade Estadual do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, a master's degree in law from Yale University, and a PhD also in law, also from the Universidade Estadual do Rio de Janeiro. And he's a professor of constitutional law, which sounds like a very relaxed position compared to being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Brazil. We're so thrilled to have you here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm very pleased to be here and to share some thoughts on democracy, populism, and role of courts. I have divided this presentation in basically three parts. The first part, I will revisit some basic concepts that we will be working on. The second part, I title What's Happening in the World. And in the third part, we are going to discuss a little bit about institutional resistance and what has been done in different parts of the world. So starting with the basic concepts, I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy, a bit about authoritarian populism, and about the role of courts. Starting with democracy, or with constitutional democracy. Constitutional democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century, having prevailed over all the alternatives that presented themselves: communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. Constitutional democracy is a concept that is like a coin with its two sides. On one side, it means popular sovereignty, free and fair elections, and rule of the majority. And on the other side, it means limited power, rule of the law, and protection of fundamental rights. Most democracies in the world these days have in their institutional arrangement a Supreme Court or a constitutional court that has as one of its roles to arbitrate the tensions that quite often occur between the two sides of the coin, between the will of the majority on one side and the constitutional values on the other side. Constitutional values meaning rule of the law and protection of fundamental rights. In modern days, democracies are made of votes, rights, and reasons, meaning that it transcends the electoral moment. It also involves the protection of fundamental rights of everyone and a public and free debate that legitimizes over time political decisions. So this is what I want to say about democracy. The second concept we're going to be working with is the idea of authoritarian populism. The world has witnessed the rise of a authoritarian, anti-pluralist, and anti-institutional wave, I would like to say, that has posed in different parts of the planet serious risks to democracies. authoritarian populism in most countries bear the mark of personalistic and charismatic leaders that manipulate fears, needs, and desires of the people, often promising simple and mistaken solutions for complex problems. Authoritarian populism can be right-wing or left-wing, but these days in the world, the main risks have been posed by far-right extremism. One characteristic of authoritarian populism is the division of society between us and them. Usually us meaning the pure, decent, conservative people, and them, the liberal, cosmopolitan, and corrupt elites. I like to emphasize that authoritarian populism usually flows through the shortcomings of democracy, the promises that weren't delivered of equal opportunity and prosperity for everyone. Authoritarian populism in most parts of the world use similar strategies, which are a direct communication with their supporters and with the masses, more recently using social media. And secondly, they bypass or they co-opt the so-called intermediary institutions that make the interface between public institutions and the people themselves. And in many parts, in third place, it includes attacks to Supreme Courts or to constitutional courts. You're probably aware that there are two main models in the world. The model that you adopt here in the US, Brazil adopts it, Canada and UK, which is the model of a Supreme Court at the top of the judicial branch. And in most countries of Europe, they adopt a different formula, a different format, which that of constitutional courts. The basic difference is that in constitutional courts, judges serve for a term, a specific term, 12 years in Germany, 9 years in Italy. So, and usually constitutional courts are kind of outside the structure of the judiciary. But basically, they both do the same thing, which is interpreting the Constitution with the possibility of declaring the unconstitutionality of acts from the other branches of government. And finally, I should add that in most places where authoritarian populism establishes itself, they deploy the tool of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and character assassination. This is a very short summary of what authoritarian populism has come to mean. And here I should make a disclaimer. I know that in the United States, at a certain point, the idea of populism wasn't exactly this one I am using here. And then populism was seen under a positive lens as a way of opposing elites at a certain point of the American history. It's not in this way I'm using the term here. I'm using in the sense of personalistic, charismatic, and authoritarian leaders that are elected by popular vote, but then afterwards, brick by brick, they deconstruct part of the pillars that sustain democracy. The last concept I want to expound here is the role of Supreme Courts. Most democracies in the world reserve part of political power to a group of public officials who are not elected, and that is the judiciary. So the role of the judiciary, and especially the role of Supreme Courts, is to interpret the Constitution to interpret the law in a technical and impartial way. That's what legitimizes the work of Supreme Courts. And Supreme Courts have basically three missions in a democracy. The first one is to ensure the rule of the majority. That means that a Supreme Court or any court of justice should not make its own will prevail over the will of the elected branches. They should only act when there is a clear violation of the Constitution. The second mission of a Supreme Court or of a constitutional court is to preserve democracy, to preserve the rule of the games. Because if there is an experience that you can see throughout history, is that majorities have the tendency of abusing their power and making change in the rules of the game to perpetuate themselves in power. And the third mission of a Supreme Court is to protect fundamental rights, including fundamental rights of minorities. This is what I wanted to say in our conceptual part of this conversation, and now I move to my second part. What's happening in the world? Although I said that constitutional democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century, something seems not to be going too well in many parts of the world, in a scenario that has been described as democratic recession, democratic backsliding, abusive constitutionalism, competitive authoritarianism, illiberal democracy, autocratic legalism, among other derogatory terms that have been used to identify political processes that went on in countries like Hungary, like Poland, Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. In all these countries, as was emphasized by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt in an acclaimed book called How Democracies Die, in these countries and in other parts of the world, the democratic erosion didn't come through coup d'etat led by generals and their soldiers. In all these countries, democratic erosion came through elected leaders, elected by popular vote, and that made changes, piecemeal changes, that in each single case did not offer a major danger, but they empty out democracy, they hollow out democracy. What are the main causes of this rise of authoritarian populism? There are, in my view, some political causes, there are some socio-economic causes, and there are some identity cultural causes that I'll briefly go through. The political causes the first one is a deficit of representativeness in electoral systems. I traveled the world for many reasons. Nobody in no country that I visited is happy with their electoral system. Everyone feels underrepresented. So that's a general feeling that democracy doesn't give voice and relevance to the common people. The second political cause is a negative perception of politics, the belief that politics revolves more around the politician's own interests than public interest itself. And in many parts of the world, what I would add, the appropriation of the public space by extractivist elites. Extractivist elites is a concept that was used by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson in an acclaimed book called Why Nations Fail, meaning elites that put the government at the service of their own interests and not of the people more generally, when we are not talking directly about corruption. So these are three political causes for this rise of authoritarian populism. The socio-economic causes are quite obvious: persistent poverty within countries and among countries, relative increase in inequality, and in countries like the United States, the idea of social stagnation and difficulty in upward mobility make many swathes of society ready to be captured by a certain type of populist discourse. And globalization and the knowledge economy have negatively impacted many segments of society, and I think the impressive rise of artificial intelligence heightened these risks. And the third set of causes are what I call cultural identity causes. Identity politics, which enabled progress in the rights of women, of people of African descent, of LGBTQA community, of indigenous communities, or people with disabilities. The progress of the rights of these segments diminished, to a certain way, the power of traditional hegemonic elites, and they are also a supporter in many cases of authoritarian populism. And one other thing that happened in different parts of the world is the emergence of stark divisions in society. Polarization is a phenomenon that you see everywhere in the world these days, in all kinds of divisions between urban and rural populations, between religious and non-religious individuals, between globalists and nationalists. And one other characteristic of authoritarian populism is the search for scapegoats. And then it just varies over time. It could be the Jews, it could be people of African descent, it could be immigrants, you name it. It could be the Muslims. It just changes from time to time who you want to blame for the problems that they are usually innocent of. And one last thing I want to add in this chapter of what's happening in the world is there's an inevitable clash between authoritarian regimes, authoritarian populist regimes, and Supreme Courts. For one simple reason: Supreme Courts interpret the Constitution. The role of the Constitution is to limit the power of majorities. Since authoritarian populism overvalue the power of majorities, they usually clash with Supreme Courts or constitutional courts, whose role is precisely to limit their power. And that's why in most populist countries, most countries where authoritarian populism got a hold, they tend to weaken and capture the Supreme Courts. First, packing the courts with submissive judges, usually by changing the rules of appointment or anticipating the age for retirement, or expanding the number of judges. That's kind of a playbook you see in Poland, in Hungary, in Venezuela. Wherever you look was pretty much the same thing. Suppression of powers of courts, as happened in Hungary, and the threat of impeachment of Supreme Court justices, as happened in Venezuela, and the threat happened in Brazil also. Besides posing serious risks to democracy, authoritarian populism has brought some other negative consequences to our lives. And I want to mention 5 of them very briefly. The first one is the loss of civility, the necessity of disqualifying whoever thinks in a different way, morally disqualifying. So it's not a debate of ideas, but it becomes a moral debate. Whoever thinks different than me is a bad person serving a bad cause. That's a horrible way to live the life. But that's what's been happening in many parts of the world. The second is there is a global articulation of extremism and a certain capture, I think, of the conservative camp by extremists in different parts of the world. Democracy has room for conservatives, for progressives, for liberals. When I say liberal, it's more in the European sense of people that favor more free enterprise and less government. That's, except for in the United States, that's the concept of liberal that is used in the world. Here, liberal and progressives are pretty much the same thing as I understand. But the interesting thing is being a conservative in a democracy usually means someone that defends the status quo, or someone that thinks that if change is inevitable, it should come incrementally. That's what traditionally being a conservative means. Well, authoritarian populism is very disruptive of the institutions. It's very revolutionary. They are anti-institutions. So they're not real conservatives, but they have this idea that everything is captured by the liberals in the American sense. So we can attack the institutions. We don't need to respect the institutions because they are all captured. That's the typical behavior of this authoritarian view, this authoritarian practice of populism. One third thing that happens in different parts of the world, and by no means I'm talking about the United States, and that would be totally improper. I'm talking about what happens in the world more generally, and sometimes in Brazil. There is a political manipulation of people's religiosity. Religion plays a very important role in the life of people. I think it's mostly a private business in the life of people. In some parts of the world, religion plays some role in the public space, but it cannot be, religiosity cannot be appropriated politically. When you start saying that my opponent is the demon, or my opponent does not defend the family or the Christian values, it's also a terrible way to disqualify whoever thinks differently. The fourth negative consequence that really strikes me is the loss of the importance of truth. The idea that people can just invent their own narratives despite the true facts, the objective facts. And this is something we are seeing in the world these days. Different tribes, they have their own narratives, and they are not exposed to an opposite view of life. The social media, the digital platforms, the way they work, they usually direct to people the ideas, the information, the ads that correspond to their previous navigation in the internet. So they only get the ideas, the news, and the ads that usually correspond to what they already think. And that creates a confirmation bias, and people start to be every day more convinced of their own reasons. They become more radical, they become more intolerant, they're not exposed to different views, and from intolerance to violence, the step is fairly short. So that's a concern that I have, because what happened is the traditional media, television, radio, and the press, they are private businesses in most democratic countries, but they had a public interest role of creating a common set of objective facts over which people would develop their own opinions. But the facts were the same. What's happening in the world is that people cannot agree anymore on the facts. They just develop their own narratives. And when this happens, communication becomes very, very difficult. This that I have in my pocket here is a pen. It's a blue pen. After this, after knowing this is a blue pen, you can say, I prefer red, I prefer black, I don't like pens. I think you are obsolete because you have a pen in the world of a personal computer. But if anyone says that this is a tire, we just lost our ability to communicate because we're not talking the same language anymore. And this is pretty much what's happening in the world. So we should make lying wrong again. That's an ethical issue. That's not a political view. And finally, I think there is a major disregard for knowledge institutions where authoritarian populism comes to power. And this disdain is evident in the attacks to the universities, to the press, to think tanks, and the disregard for intellectuals more generally. So I think these are 5 important negative consequences besides the risks to democracy. The loss of civility, this capture of the conservative camp by extremists. The characteristic of an extremist is the intolerance, the non-acceptance of the other. Third, the political manipulation of people's religiosity, the loss of the importance of truth, and the disregard for knowledge institutions. I come from a country, I come from Brazil, where democracy suffered serious threats, and I'll just briefly describe them, and then I'll close. We lived in Brazil in past few years, a politicization of armed forces. Whoever is familiar with Latin America knows that politicization of armed forces is the way to dictatorship. It's a major threat. We went through it. We had very outrageous attacks on the Supreme Court and on its justices, direct attacks on the press and journalists. We had attempts to discredit the reliability of the electoral process. Brazil has the most reliable electoral process on earth. It's all electronic. It's checked by all political parties, by the federal police, by the district attorney, by international observers. It's a computer software. Then when everyone is satisfied, it's sealed, and then it's inserted in the electronic ballot box by pen drive. It never goes online so that no one can hack it. We have 150 million voters, and 4, 5, 6 hours at the most after the elections, we publicize the results. It's incredible. I always try to guess why other countries don't use this. I was here as an observer in the 2020 elections. It was in DC and in Maryland. I was the head of the electoral court in Brazil, and I spoke with one of the commissioners. And when I saw the paper ballot being filled, I said, "Wait, how come you don't have a more, modern, this is a very sophisticated country, the leader of technology in the world, and you still use..." And the answer he gave me was very interesting. He said, well, this is a country where the incumbent is reelected in over 90% of the cases. So no one wants to change anything. So I'm not sure that's a satisfactory answer, but that's the answer I got. So when you try to discredit the system by saying it's fraudulent and whoever was elected shouldn't be there, it's a way to prepare, to pave the way to do something wrong. At least that was the case in Brazil. There was the refusal to concede to the victory of the winning candidate. After the elections, you wouldn't believe what happened in Brazil. Thousands of people camped before military barracks, claiming for a military coup with the support of the government that was leaving office. And then in January 8th, 2023, we had our January 6th in Brazil, where a mob of thousands of people invaded Congress, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was the target of the strongest hate of those people, because the former president had elected the court as his main enemy. And then it's still under investigation, but over 30 people have been indicted for an attempted coup. Apparently, it's still under investigation. The former president has been accused of articulating from here, where he came, not here, DC, from Florida, a coup d'etat. I'm not saying it happened, it's still under judgment, but that's what the indictment was for. And the court was the main opposer of this authoritarian trend, and we clashed with the president several times. And one last thing I want to say, the Brazilian Supreme Court plays a kind of a distinct role compared to the US Supreme Court, because we have a much more comprehensive constitution that deals with issues that in this country would be deemed political. So the Brazilian Constitution deals with protection of the environment, protection of indigenous communities, deals with the social security system, with the tax system, with the healthcare system, with the educational system, with the budgetary system, with the role of the state and of the government in economic affairs. It rules on the political parties, you name it. So many issues that in this country would be deemed political, in Brazil they are judicialized and they become legal issues. And so the court in Brazil has a protagonism that you wouldn't see here in the United States. Besides that, you can reach the court through a case or controversy requirement, like here, through writ of certiorari, but we also have direct actions. So you can file direct actions before the Supreme Court challenging a constitutional provision as unconstitutional, or challenging the insufficiency of a public policy provided for in the Constitution. And these direct actions can be filed by a whole lot of entities with standing, meaning that in Brazil, just about anything of minimal relevance can reach the Supreme Court. So we decide many more things than are decided here, including the most divisive issues of the country, the issues that goes from abortion to demarcation of indigenous lands, from embryonic stem cell research to complex taxation issues. Everything ends up at the court. So the court is often a political target of people that are not satisfied with the decisions. So I want to leave some time for a conversation if anyone would be interested. So I want to close. I wrote down three basic conclusions. When courts are indispensable to resist to authoritarian populism. If a court of justice is captured, there's no way out. But courts alone cannot stall the process. They need the support of civil society, they need support of the press, they need support at least of part of the political establishment. Otherwise, they lose, as they lost in Venezuela, as they lost in Nicaragua, as they lost in Hungary, to say a few examples. The other thing, in an environment filled with people that have a democratic view, I want to say democracy is currently experiencing a period of discredit in different parts of the world. It's necessary to make severe diagnosis to identify the reasons for this fact. Many people, especially younger people, no longer identify with the values that have brought us here: substantive freedom, equal opportunities, and dignity for all. And furthermore, many others have never truly benefited from these values. So authoritarian populism unites people on the basis that were excluded from the benefits of democracy, and people at the top of the pyramid that lost part of their hegemony with the rise of other important groups. And third and finally, the world is facing a time of darkness with more might and less rights, more arrogance and less justice. These will be times of resistance and effort to keep the lights on. History is not linear. It is made up of advances and setbacks. But our role as citizens, as workers, as intellectuals, is to push history in the right direction. And the right direction is that of good, justice, and inclusion of all people. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I sit down for the conversation?
Sure. I know you have a commitment and you may need to leave soon, but I think we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for a couple of questions. Okay, wonderful. So we have a question here.
Thank you so much, Chief Justice, for this enlightening speech. My name is Marianne Kneuer. I'm a visiting fellow here at Kellogg. And I have actually a twofold question for you. The Brazilian Supreme Court played a huge role during what you called authoritarian populism, the phases, the period of Bolsonaro. It's quite clear and obvious that the Supreme Court played this important role. I would like to hear from you what steps you think were particularly important, what steps that you took in the court were particularly important for defending democracy, because you also said that it's a mission of the Supreme Court to defend democracy. You said this in your speech, so I think you were aware that you want to take steps to defend democracy. And then the second part of my question would refer to the time period after Bolsonaro, which is then a period which we could call post-erosion or post-backsliding period. And here I would like to hear from you what you perceive your role as a Supreme Court for this period, where you want to reconstruct democracy maybe, or where you want to support the reconstruction of democracy. So, twofold question, I'm sorry for that, but I'm highly interested to hear your opinion.
Oh, both are very interesting. I think a court of justice should react from the first moment. If you tolerate thinking that it won't happen, it will happen. That's what happened in Hungary. When they started changing the legislation and made a constitutional amendment, suppressing powers of the court, the Constitutional Court of Hungary hesitated and validated those amendments. And they were never the same. They were totally captured afterwards. So you must step forward in the first moment and say, there's a limit here. You can't trespass. It might sound difficult in certain junctures, and you run the risk of losing. But of course, you would like to avoid clashing. But if you don't play the role that a Supreme Court should play, there's no point in being there. So even at the risk of losing, I think you should play your role. When someone asked me, what advice would you give to a judge in a country where authoritarian populism is growing and threatening the court, my advice would be telling this judge, live for your own biography, not for anyone else's. And I think that's we should do. Not being arrogant nor pretentious, just play your role. Humbly play in your role. I think that would be what I would say. Don't concede thinking that you will get better. Just like happened in, just to give you a comparison, with England at the beginning of the Second World War until Churchill came to power. You make concessions thinking it's going to get better, and it keeps getting worse. So don't make concessions at the outset. That would be my advice. Second, the second question is very delicate for me to answer, but I'll try to do it in the way I can do. The court had to expand its powers to do the job it did. And it might come soon the time that we need to retreat a little bit from excessive power. That was necessary. But then the risks are behind us. But usually when you expand, it's harder to go back to the previous size. But I think eventually is what's going to happen, and what I think we ought to do. It's kind of bringing the genius back to the bottle. Not easy.
Thank you, Barroso, for your speech. It's a very keen subject for me. I guess it's more like a follow-up question. So we were talking about some of the steps, right? And you said like, well, you have to start acting as soon as you realize there is the need for it. So my question was like, when did the Supreme Court came to realize that Brazilian democracy could be in danger? And then once this was realized, was there, because in a talk today, one of the examples we saw was that in a case in Argentina was an overall unified idea within all the judges of what should be done to like halt any or stop any democratic erosion process. So like, was there a unified opinion among the judges of like those steps that the Supreme Court should take, and was it necessary if not?
Well, the Brazilian Supreme Court is very plural. It's a bit different from the US Supreme Court, where people are labeled conservatives and liberals. In Brazil, it's a bit more nuanced than that. However, although we are a very plural court, we were very united in preserving democracy. Because we lived, most of us at the court lived through a military dictatorship. So I met people that were tortured. I met journalists that were censored. I had friends that came back from exile. So we know well what a dictatorship is. So, and all of us. So we were very united and not letting the process go backwards. Brazil has been a democracy since 1985, and we are very proud of it. So we didn't have much difficulty in getting the court united. And then we fought in different fronts. It's interesting because first came the pandemic. The former president was in total denial of the pandemic, thinking it's irrelevant, it's just a different kind of code, and didn't do anything important at the first moment. So the Supreme Court intervened, and we assured that the states and the municipalities could act in the vacuum of the federal government. So the federal government is not doing, the states can do. Afterwards, in face of the inertia of the government, we ordered the government to present a vaccination plan, that there wasn't any. And then when the vaccine became available, we ordered mandatory vaccination. We required that any foreigner coming in Brazil had to present a vaccination certificate, just like the United States did. So this was probably the first battle at the beginning of the pandemic. And then the president was in total denial of the climate change issue. And we had a major increase in the deforestation of the Amazon, which is a very important asset of Brazil that, for a totally mistaken view, was seen as a hurdle to progress, and a view that deforestation and having cattle ranching or soybeans or whatever is a sign of progress, even if it would tear down the forest, which was a totally mistaken view. And as I said before, the Brazilian Constitution says that a healthy, balanced environment is a fundamental right. The government has the duty to protect it. And then Article 225 describes the actions that the government need to take. So in Brazil, that's not a political issue. It's a legal issue. So we interfered, and with at least 3 judgments by the court relating to environmental protection. So that was another clash. Then came the protection of indigenous communities. Usually, people in the far right don't like indigenous communities, but the pandemic could just destroy them. If you didn't have sanitary barriers protecting the indigenous communities, they would be decimated. So we acted, ordering the government to protect the indigenous communities. So we started clashing even before the first moves against democracy started. One decisive chapter in which the court clashed with the former government was when they wanted to go back to paper ballot. They presented a constitutional amendment to go back to paper ballot. Paper ballot in Brazil has always been the way to rig the elections. So when we got the electronic votes, we ended fraud. There's no way you can fraud the system in the electronic voting. So the battle against was a public battle. I even went to Congress, which is very atypical. But since it was a constitutional amendment being discussed, and they invited me to go there, I refused at first, but then I did go. And basically to tell them, you were all elected through this system. You want to go back to a system where you can lose your seat for a fraudulent counting of votes? We won this battle, and that was the moment where the former president really elected myself at that moment, and then the court, because the court also avoided the going back to paper ballot. If we had conceded there, I think we would have lost democracy, because we are talking about people that were able to invade the headquarters of Congress, of the Supreme Court, and of the presidential palace. Just imagine what they could have done in the voting stations where votes were being counted manually, and what they would do in those stations. So, and then we avoided other decisions by the government, hollowing out some civil society institutions. So it was not one decision. It was over time a set of decisions that included issues that were not directly related to democracy, but related to the enforcement of the Constitution in protecting indigenous communities, protecting the health of population, protecting the environment. So we had a very contentious relationship. And one thing I want to stress here, that didn't make us popular among everyone, because the president, former president, he wasn't reelected, but he got 49% of the vote, and we were the enemies. So there is an important part of the Brazilian population that still think we were the enemies. And besides this part of the population, we decide the most divisive issues of the Brazilian society. So there are other people that dislike us. So when I read a survey saying that if you sum people that trust a lot in the court and people that have some trust in the court, and it amounted to 49%, I said, thank God, it could be much worse for the amount of people with displeas. But it's not part of the role of a court of justice to please everyone. It's to interpret the Constitution and protect rights.
Justice, it was a very inspiring talk. So my question is about how far a court or a justice can go with these sanctions. Unlike the US, Bolsonaro was prevented to run again in the upcoming election. But my concern is that when a candidate cannot run, he typically tried to fight or to participate out of the system, and that decision can also increase polarization. So what, from your view, could be a proper measure of action that a court can take to fight or to face illiberal or anti-democratic behavior?
If someone, anyone, is unfairly being persecuted, I think it could generate this effect that you mentioned, that creating kind of an underground support. But in the case of the former president, we have it in the electoral process in Brazil is overseen by courts. We have an electoral court system. We have trial level courts, appellate courts, and a superior court of justice, electoral court of justice, which is a system that I strongly recommend. The electoral process should not be run by politicians that have interest in the outcome. So I think the way, this is a wonderful country. I come here often. I study it here. I like it very much. I come often, but this is something that I think we do better. The way we conduct elections. So the former president was stripped of his political rights for 8 years, as you said, because in the electoral legislation in Brazil, there are provisions that say you can be deprived of your political rights for 8 years if you abuse political office. And the former president, that was the decision of the court, he summoned, shortly before the elections, all foreign ambassadors stationed in Brazil and said, the system is fraudulent. I have evidence. I won. Brazil is such a unique country that the winner says that there was fraud. So he said that there was fraud in the elections. He won because he only won in the second round, not in the first round. And he said there was fraud because I should have won in the first round. But actually, he was preparing the way to say that if he lost the elections, there was fraud. And he said that he had evidence. And he told that to the foreign ambassadors. So he was summoned to present the evidence. There wasn't any. So and in other instances, he said the system is fraudulent. I have evidence. In many forums, he said that. So the electoral court understood that that was an abuse of office. He was using the office to disseminate something that was untrue and that could compromise the democratic process. And that was the grounds for the decision. And everybody understood that because it clearly happened. And so there isn't the perception that it was an unfair decision, that he was persecuted. People know he did that. Even his supporters know he did that. So I don't think there's the risk of a legitimate reaction to this decision of the court. And there hasn't been, indeed. The president himself claims for amnesty, and I think he's in his right to claim for amnesty. If he's going to get, who knows?
Minister Barroso, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.